Old woman, hand over your $1 million and get out of my house." Those were the first words I heard on Christmas morning. No greeting, no warmth. Just that sentence thrown at me like a piece of trash, landing on the hardwood floor. I froze. I was standing in the middle of my son's living room, a cinnamon roll still warm on the small paper plate in my hand. The frosting had begun to melt, dripping onto my fingers, but I barely felt it. Everyone went silent as if someone had pressed pause on the world. Brandon stepped forward, grabbed the red envelope I brought for Lily, ripped it from my hand and threw it onto the coffee table as if it offended him. The envelope slid across the polished wood and stopped against a scented candle that read, "Family First." The irony nearly choked me. Behind him, Tessa fumbled with her phone. Her live stream was still open, her voice chipper, only moments earlier, as she showed her followers their perfect Christmas morning. The moment she saw the confrontation forming, she scrambled to end it. She whispered sharply, "I'm not letting this get on my channel. My name is Maya Collins. I am 58 years old. I handle payroll for 700 nurses and doctors at the largest hospital system in Spokane. I manage millions of dollars in salaries every month with precision down to the cent. Yet in my own son's living room, I was nothing more than an old woman hoarding money. I came to Washington with Mark 30 years ago. He worked HVAC. I worked numbers. We bought a tiny house on a street no one wanted then. We built a life slowly and quietly. The last 3 years after Mark's diagnosis, I worked full-time and cared for him full-time until he passed the previous Christmas. I buried him with my own hands. I scraped through every bill. I still visited my son every Sunday just to feel like I had someone left. That morning should have been gentle. Instead, it felt like someone flipped the world upside down. Brandon laughed under his breath and repeated himself louder this time. "You have had your life. We have a mortgage, car payments, expansion plans. What do you even need $1 million for? To rot alone in that little house?" I felt my chest tighten. I watched my son's face and searched for the boy who once held my hand while crossing snowy parking lots. I could not find him. Tessa crossed her arms and said, "Our followers think it's sweet you still come over, but honestly, it's getting pathetic, Maya." Pathetic. I swallowed hard. Brandon shoved my old winter coat into my arms. It smelled like his father's workshop from years ago. He pointed toward the door as if escorting a stranger out. Then he reached above the fireplace, grabbed the stocking embroidered with Mom in faded thread, and stuffed it into a garbage bag. Lily stepped out from the hallway, unsure, hugging her stuffed reindeer. But before she could say anything, Tessa pulled her back. "Go to your room. Grown-up talk." The door slammed behind me. Snow hit my face like tiny shards. I do not know how long I stood there on their porch, but eventually I whispered through the cold air, "I paid your first rent in this town. I co-signed your truck. I buried your father with my own hands." Brandon turned his back. His final words cut deeper than the others. "Yeah, and now it is your turn to pay up again." I drove home in silence. My Corolla rattled in the wind. The streets of Hilliard were quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. I walked into my small 2-bedroom house, turned on the electric heater, and hung the stocking with Mom back above my own fireplace. I had pulled it out of the trash without them seeing. I heated a frozen dinner, but my hands trembled too much to lift the fork. So I sat there in the glow of the heater, listening to the hum of old wiring, feeling every inch of the day press down on me. Finally, I went to my desk. I opened the top drawer. Inside were documents most people never knew I had. Deeds for call-in storage and units. 12 lots Mark bought during the recession. A thick envelope from Liberty Credit Union labeled Business Loan, Personal Guarantee. I closed it. Not yet. They think my life is just one retirement account with 7 digits. They think I barely understand the money I saved. They have no idea what else is tied to my name or what sits under the business my son brags about. I reached for the stack of unopened mail. One envelope carried the crest of the state of Washington. My heart sank as I opened it. Inside was a notice stating Brandon was 3 months behind on the payment for the office building where his HVAC company operated. The last line caught my eye and held me still. As co-owner and guarantor, you may assume or restructure this note. I stared at those words. Co-owner and guarantor. My hand flattened on the table. A warmth rose in my chest, not from anger, but from clarity. My son thought I was just an old woman with $1 million. He forgot I also held the paper under his business. The morning after Christmas arrived with a stillness so sharp it felt like the world was holding its breath. And when I opened my eyes, the first thing I sensed was the lingering scent of the room spray from Brandon's house, clinging to my coat, a fake peppermint sweetness that seemed to mock everything that had happened the day before. And as I lay there for a moment staring at the faint light pushing through the blinds, I realized I had not truly slept. I had only drifted in and out of the kind of restless haze a person falls into after a wound they cannot yet understand has been carved open. I pushed myself up slowly, and the motion alone made the echo of Brandon's voice throb at the back of my mind, those words replaying without mercy, and something inside me tightened when I realized I had been gripping the edge of the blanket as if expecting someone to yank it away. I walked to the kitchen and turned on the small lamp above the sink, letting its soft yellow glow warm the cold air. Then I stood there watching the steam rise from the kettle, while memories from other Christmas mornings began to drift in uninvited scenes of the years when our old house had been filled with the smell of cinnamon and pine. When Mark sat at the head of the table, wearing his slightly crooked Santa hat and laughing loudly as Lily climbed into his lap, when Brandon would nudge my arm and say, "Mom, you make the best holiday ham in the county," and everything felt anchored and safe in a way I assumed would last forever. I remembered the year when snow piled all the way up to the porch railing, and Mark insisted on shoveling a path before dinner, so that if any neighbor happened to walk by, they would not slip. And after we finished the meal, he leaned across the table and squeezed my hand and said softly, "We do not leave family out in the cold, Maya." And I nodded because it seemed like a rule so simple and so human that nothing could ever undo it. And yet, here I was standing alone in my kitchen while the memory of my own son slamming a door in my face pressed against my ribs like a physical weight. I carried my tea to the small desk in the corner and opened my laptop, the familiar password screen, greeting me with the same bland blue I saw every morning before work, and I tried to force my mind to move mechanically the way it always did when I had to process numbers or check payroll figures. But this time my hand trembled slightly as I opened my retirement accounts, the rows of digits blinking back at me from the Fidelity dashboard. My accounts showed the same balance Mark and I had built slowly and carefully, the $1 million spread across the 401k and IRA, and the life insurance payout I received after he passed money. He once described as a safety net for the years when he could no longer hold a wrench or climb onto a roof. Money, he said, belonged to me because I was the one who kept the house standing when his body grew weak and his breath turned shallow. His voice came back to me now, steady and gentle, saying, "This is for you, not for Brandon's next toy," and hearing it in my mind made my throat tighten, because it reminded me that even in his worst days, he had seen clearly what I had refused to acknowledge, that Brandon's sense of entitlement had begun to turn into something darker long before I understood what it meant. As I was closing the tab, a notification pinged on my phone, a sound so sharp it sliced through the quiet kitchen, and when I turned the screen over, my son's name glared at me in bold letters. The message was brief, curt, almost transactional, and read, "We are serious. You either help or do not expect to see your granddaughter. Much." And the words hit me harder than the ones he hurled the day before because they were written without heat, without a moment of hesitation, as if he had already accepted the idea of restricting my place in Lily's life as nothing more than a tactic to get what he wanted, using my granddaughter like a bargaining chip. I sat there staring at the text, feeling something inside me contract. Not anger exactly, but a deep ache that spread slowly through my chest, and I whispered her name under my breath, because the thought of losing the little girl who still hugged me with her full weight made me feel as if the ground beneath me had cracked open. I opened my laptop again this time, pulling up the 529 college fund that I had helped set up the year Brandon and Tessa announced they were expecting a fund I contributed to every few months with whatever extra money I could put aside, because I wanted Lily to step into adulthood without the burden of loans that had shadowed so many of the nurses I processed paychecks for, and I waited for the familiar balance to appear on the screen. When it loaded, I blinked, assuming the number had not fully refreshed, and hit the button again, but the same figure stared back at me significantly lower than the last time I checked. My pulse quickened as I clicked into the transaction history and scrolled through the entries, each line showing withdrawals made in small increments over the past year, movements that seemed designed to go unnoticed unless someone looked closely. At the bottom of the page, the authorization signature appeared a shaky imitation of my own name, the letters forming M. Collins in a way that looked almost right, but not quite as if someone had copied it from memory rather than from a document. A cold wave moved through me, starting at the center of my spine and spreading outward, and for a moment I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. I felt my breath catch as the truth settled heavy in my chest, because there was only one explanation, only one person who had access, only one person who knew my signature well enough to forge it, yet cared so little about the consequences that he used his daughter's future as a personal bank account. Brandon had stolen from Lily and pretended I had approved it, and the realization did not explode inside me like rage. It landed quietly and painfully, like the final piece of a puzzle I had been refusing to assemble. When I finally gathered enough steadiness in my breath to speak with anyone about what I had found, I called the bank, my voice low and controlled, as I explained that I needed clarification on several withdrawals made from my granddaughter's college fund, and the young woman on the line answered with the cheerful, scripted politeness they all use until I gave her my name and account number, and she paused before saying, "We've signed authorization on file from you, Miss Collins," the words landing with a dull thud inside my stomach as if they were meant to pull the ground out from under me. I asked her to repeat it, and she did, without hesitation, completely confident in a system that had documented something I knew I had never signed, and I heard myself request an in-person appointment, because there was no way I could let this conversation remain a floating voice on a phone line. The next morning I drove to Liberty Credit Union, the same small brick building where Mark and I had opened our first joint account decades ago, and walking through the double doors felt surreal, as if time were folding onto itself, because I had always considered this place part of the stable background of my life, a place where my name meant careful records and on-time payments and steady responsibility. Yet when the teller guided me to a small office and the bank manager pulled up the authorization, I felt a strange mix of dread and fury rise in me. He turned the screen toward me, and there it was, a shaky version of my signature. The letters stiff and slanted in a way mine never were, the strokes thick as if the pen had been gripped too tightly, and even if someone in that room had never met me a single day in their life, they would know that signature had been written by a man trying to imitate a woman. The manager glanced at me and offered an apologetic half-smile as he said, "Your son explained that you agreed, but sometimes forget things lately," and his tone tried to soften the blow, but it only made the words sink deeper, because it was not just that Brandon forged my signature. He had built a story about me being confused or forgetful, as if I were some frail woman whose memory wandered off without notice. Hearing that version of me said aloud created a pressure behind my eyes that was not quite tears, but more like a slow burn of humiliation mixed with a sharp grief, because the narrative they used to excuse fraud was the same one that strips older women of credibility, identity, and authority, turning them into caricatures of fragility. I kept my gaze steady as I asked to speak with someone else, and that was when Carl entered the room, a newer face but not unfamiliar, because he had transferred from the downtown location a few months back and had once recognized me as the woman who always brought cookies to the employees during the stressful payroll season at the hospital. He nodded to me with genuine respect and introduced himself again, then sat down and pulled up my account history, tapping thoughtfully as he scrolled, and I watched his expression shift slightly when he saw how long I had been a member and how consistent my financial management had always been. He looked up and lowered his voice, saying, "Miss Collins, you know someone committing fraud against a co-owner is serious," his tone carrying more weight than the words themselves. And although he said co-owner casually, I felt a small tightening in my chest because he had just revealed he knew more than he was explicitly stating. I nodded but did not elaborate, choosing silence as my strength, because I sensed he was testing whether I was aware of the implications. I could tell he had begun piecing things together from the fragments in front of him, and for a moment I saw something almost like concern flicker in his expression, not pity, but an awareness that I was not the confused older woman my son painted me to be, that I understood numbers, contracts, and legal boundaries better than Brandon ever would. Then Carl asked the question that shifted the room's temperature. He asked if I wanted to review the collateral documents attached to Brandon's business loan, and he phrased it neutrally, but with enough emphasis that I understood this was not a standard courtesy. I hesitated only for a second before answering yes, and he retrieved a digital file before turning the screen toward me once more, and what I saw there made my breath still completely. The building Brandon used for his HVAC business, the property he bragged about renovating the same office he claimed to have built from the ground up, was still legally tied to me as co-owner, not him, because the original structure had once been part of a land bundle Mark purchased years ago, a deal I had forgotten existed until this moment. And next to that building listed as collateral was the storage facility, the same one I maintained quietly without fanfare, the same one Mark insisted be under my name alone after his second financial scare, the same one Brandon had never taken the time to understand. The documents made one thing unmistakably clear. Brandon was only the borrower, not the owner. And if he continued to default or commit fraud, I had full legal standing to assume control of the assets. I stared at the screen, letting the revelation settle deep inside me, not with exhilaration, but with a sobering clarity, understanding that what Brandon thought was his growing empire was in reality built on ground he never truly owned. Ground I had kept stable for decades. As Carl watched me absorb the information, he asked gently if I wanted printed copies for my records, and I nodded slowly, knowing this was no longer just about betrayal, but about a shift in the balance of power that neither Brandon nor Tessa had even imagined possible. Driving back from the credit union that afternoon, the printed documents resting on the passenger seat like quiet witnesses to a life I had half forgotten, I found my mind drifting not to Brandon's threats or Tessa's smug comments, but to the very beginning of the story that had led us here to a strip of land most people never noticed when they drove past a row of faded metal doors that held far more than old furniture and boxes. They held the proof that Mark had always seen a version of me my son never bothered to look for. Look. Years ago, long before Brandon had a business name on the side of a truck, and long before social media turned every family moment into a staged performance, Mark came home from a job with a strange energy in his eyes. He hung his jacket on the back of the chair and said he had run into an old friend from his apprenticeship days, the kind of friend who used to sleep on our couch when we were first married, a man who had once dreamed big and then watched those dreams collapse in a recession that chewed up small tradesmen and spit them out with ruined credit and past due notices. That friend owned a small storage lot on the edge of town, 12 units lined up under a perpetually gray sky, the kind of place people used when life forced them to choose what to keep and what to let go. And he was desperate to sell before the bank took it entirely, so he asked Mark if we wanted it. Not as a gold mine, but as a lifeline, for both of them, something Mark could manage on the side while his friend stepped away from the wreckage of his finances. Mark had already gone through his own brush with bankruptcy once he knew what it felt like to sit at a kitchen table, surrounded by final notices, and wonder which utility could be turned off without endangering Lily's sleep. So when he told me about the lot, he did not talk like a man chasing profit. He talked like someone trying to pull another person back from the edge and at the same time give his family a small anchor that no employer or economic downturn could take away. He insisted the deed go in my name. He said I already had better credit and more stability because my paycheck came every 2 weeks, whether snow fell or contracts dried up. And he said, if anything ever happened to him, he wanted at least one thing in this world tied only to me, so no one could argue about who it belonged to. Not the bank, not creditors, not even our own son, if he grew up with more ego than sense. We signed the papers in a cramped office that smelled like stale coffee and printer ink, and I remember how my hand shook a little as I wrote my name, because buying property felt like something other people did. People with briefcases and perfect hair and financial advisors, not a payroll clerk and an HVAC tech from the north side of Spokane. The first few years, the storage lot did not seem like much. A few checks each month, a few late-night calls about broken locks or flickering lights, but slowly, it became a quiet rhythm in our lives. The rent payments coming in steadily, even when Mark's job slowed the extra income covering surprise medical bills or car repairs, or the summer program Lily wanted to try. And later, when my niece decided she wanted to go to nursing school, and her mother cried because they had no idea how to help it, was that steady $6,000 or $7,000 a month from those tired metal doors that paid tuition installments and kept her in textbooks and scrubs until she walked across the stage in white shoes with tears in her eyes. Brandon never really asked about the lot when he did drive past it. As a teenager, he would make a joke about my little row of garages and say things like, "You know, nothing about business, Mom, you just file numbers while I build things." And he would say it with a laugh that felt harmless then, but looking back, I realized there was always a thin vein of contempt under it, a belief that what I did was small and what he would do someday would be grand and deserving of applause. He never saw me sitting at the kitchen table late at night, balancing our accounts, making sure the mortgage cleared and the medical bills got paid before they were sent to collections, renegotiating insurance premiums, and quietly adjusting our budget so that his sports fees and school trips were covered without him ever feeling the panic that hummed constantly beneath the surface of our adult lives. Because I was the one who refused to let our family slide back into the chaos Mark had known in his early years. Remembering all of that while I drove the snow starting to drift again across the road made the present sting even more, because the same son who once had his entire world held up by my invisible math now had the nerve to say I knew nothing about business, that I was hoarding money out of spite, that I was an obstacle to his success rather than the foundation beneath it. That evening, when I got home, I carried the bank envelope and collateral documents to my desk and set them next to an older stack of papers I had not touched since Mark died, a pile I had avoided sorting because it smelled faintly of his aftershave and brought tears before I could finish even one page. And for the first time since the funeral, I forced myself to go through every sheet, opening manila folders, smoothing creases, reading notes he had scribbled in the margins. At the bottom of the stack, buried under warranty papers and an old union newsletter, I found an email printout slightly yellowed at the edges, the subject line written in Mark's no-nonsense style. "If Brandon ever turns on you, here is what you need to know," and my heart stumbled at the bluntness of the words, as if he had seen farther down the road than I was willing to look. He had printed the message because he knew I trusted paper more than screens, and attached to it was a copy of the original contract for the office building now used by Brandon's company, the same building currently listed as collateral on the loan I had just learned about. I read the highlighted section slowly, my finger tracing each sentence, the clause stating that if the borrower committed fraud or engaged in misconduct against the co-owner had the explicit right to unilaterally restructure, or assume full control of the property. And as the meaning settled into my bones, I felt a strange new steadiness replace the earlier shaking in my hands, because this was not just a safety net. It was Mark's final way of standing beside me in a future he suspected might require more protection than love alone could offer. The night I found Mark's email, I barely slept, the pages of the contract replaying behind my eyes, as if they had been etched into the darkness itself. And by morning, a quiet resolve had settled over me, not the kind born from rage, but from something steadier, something that came from realizing I had one duty left in this world that mattered more than my pride or my heartbreak, and that was protecting Lily before her parents' irresponsibility reached the part of her life that could never be rebuilt. I called Jenna Ruiz, first thing the same attorney who had helped me settle Mark's estate, a woman who spoke with the kind of measured clarity that made people tell the truth without realizing they were doing it. And when she picked up, I heard myself say, in a voice far calmer than I felt that I needed to see her today, if possible, because I had discovered something that could change everything. She agreed immediately, and by early afternoon I was sitting across from her polished wooden desk, my hands folded tightly in my lap as I recounted the entire chain of events that had unfolded since Christmas morning, from Brandon's demand for $1 million to the humiliation in front of Tessa's camera, to the discovery of the empty college fund and the forged signature that still made my stomach twist each time I thought of it. Jenna listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly at certain points, especially when I described how Brandon had framed it as a misunderstanding caused by my supposed forgetfulness. And when I finished, she leaned back slowly and said with a tone both stunned and clinical, "Maya, what you are describing is not only fraud, but potential elder financial abuse." And although her words were not emotional, they carried a weight that made my heart thump harder, because hearing a legal professional say it aloud confirmed that this was not just a family conflict spiraling out of control, it was a crime. She asked to see the printed signatures, the bank statements, the collateral documents, and she examined them with a precision that made me grateful she was on my side. Then she tapped the paper lightly and said the phrase that shifted everything for me. "Maya, you have enough right here to put your son in handcuffs if you wanted to." The thought of that made my throat tighten painfully, because no matter what Brandon had done, I still saw flashes of the little boy who used to run to me after school with scraped knees and big dreams, and I admitted quietly that I did not want him in jail, at least not if there was another path. I only wanted to make sure Lily's future was protected, and that Brandon never again had the opportunity to weaponize my age or my love against me. Jenna nodded, understanding more from my silence than my words, and she leaned forward to outline a plan so rational and protective that for the first time in days, I felt something like air enter my lungs. She explained that instead of confronting Brandon directly or filing charges immediately, we could transfer the entire 5/29 plan into a new education trust, managed by me and an independent trustee, making it legally unreachable by Brandon, even if he attempted to forge permission again. And she emphasized that Lily would still receive the funds, but only when she reached college age, meaning the money would go exactly where Mark intended, without ever passing through her father's hands. She described this trust as a quiet shield, the kind people in messy divorces or complicated families often use to keep children safe from financial chaos. And hearing her say that made me realize how common my situation truly was. How many women my age had watched their good intentions drained or misused by children who confused entitlement with need. Jenna also told me to keep every piece of evidence stored securely: the forged signatures, the withdrawal records, the email threads, the collateral documents Brandon never bothered to read, because we would not file anything yet, not until Brandon pushed far enough that we needed to. I left her office feeling steadier, but that calm did not last long, because as soon as I started my car, my phone buzzed with a voice message from Brandon, his voice loud and venomous through the speakers as he snarled, "I heard you went crying to the bank. You trying to ruin me, old woman." the words erupting with the same contempt he had shown on Christmas morning, except sharper, now more frantic, as if he sensed something was slipping out of his grip. Before I could even respond, another message popped up, this time from Tessa Kurt, and patronizing delete. "Whatever you did with the college fund, Brandon said it is his money now. You are not thinking straight." I stared at the message for a long moment. The audacity of calling me confused while demanding access to a child's stolen future, revealing the full scope of how little they valued me beyond what I could give them. And instead of replying, I placed the phone face down and drove home in silence, letting their words fade behind me like exhaust in the cold. That evening, Jenna sent a final email with an attachment and a short note saying, "Read this when you are ready." And when I opened the file, I found a draft of a lawsuit already formatted in clean legal language, the title stark and chilling: State of Washington versus Brandon Collins for fraud and elder financial exploitation. And seeing my son's name under those charges felt like a stone dropping deep inside me. Not because I intended to file it today, but because I knew with absolute clarity that this was real leverage, real accountability, real protection. I signed the document lightly at the bottom, with the understanding that it would not be submitted unless absolutely necessary, and then I tucked the signed copy into my home safe, where it sat like a silent blade, hovering above the choices my son would make, next a reminder that I no longer had to beg or plead or defend myself, because the power he thought he had taken from me had been sitting in my hands all along, waiting for the moment I chose to lift it. In the days that followed, I found myself watching the world around Brandon more closely, not because I wanted to spy on him or gather ammunition, but because something inside me had shifted after signing Jenna's document, a quiet understanding that knowledge was no longer a burden, but a tool. And if I was going to protect Lily and restore my own footing, I needed to see my son's life clearly, without the haze of sentiment or denial that had clouded my vision for years. One cold Thursday morning, I drove toward the industrial strip where his HVAC office sat, a single-story building with a bright blue sign that always made Brandon beam with pride, a place he liked to describe as the headquarters of his growing empire. Though now, when I parked across the street, the building looked smaller and more fragile than I remembered, almost as if the weight of his unpaid bills and silent mismanagement was pressing down on the roof. I sat in my car with the heater running and watched as two technicians loaded equipment into a truck, wrapped in flashy branding that promised trust and reliability. The kind of marketing message Brandon loved because it made him feel like the successful business owner he had always imagined himself to be. But I noticed how one of the workers hesitated before closing the back latches, as if unsure whether the parts they needed had actually been restocked. A small sign that operations were not as smooth behind the scenes as Tessa's curated videos suggested. Speaking of Tessa, she appeared moments later at the doorway of the office, wearing a perfectly coordinated outfit, holding her phone at a flattering angle, as she live-streamed some cheerful update to the followers who adored her version of reality. A scripted world where every day was a family victory and every decision painted her as a supportive wife. Though I could hear only fragments through my cracked window. Her tone bright and sugary, her laughter sharp and rehearsed, so polished it almost echoed against the cold metal siding of the building. Watching her perform in front of a ring light held by a small stand near the door made me realize how much of their life had become a stage, with Brandon playing the hard-working provider and Tessa, the loving partner, all while their unpaid contracts sat in stacks behind the reception desk and their debts stretched thin enough that one more misstep could snap everything in half. I turned away from the office and walked toward a small convenience store nearby to buy a cup of coffee, needing something warm in my hands, because the cold air was starting to settle under my skin, and as soon as I stepped inside, the owner looked up from the register with a spark of recognition, his face opening into a warm smile as he said, "Are you not Mark's wife, the storage lady? Because we all know you basically saved this block when you kept that lot open during COVID." And his words struck me so unexpectedly that for a moment I simply stood there holding a coffee lid without knowing what to say. I finally nodded and thanked him quietly, feeling heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the beverage, because it was the first time in a long while someone saw me as something other than an aging woman to be dismissed or pressured for money. And hearing that I had unknowingly strengthened a small part of the community reminded me that I had spent years creating stability. Others depended on something Brandon had never cared enough to notice. I left the store feeling strangely steadier, though that calm evaporated when I returned to my car and heard a familiar voice drifting through the cold air from behind the office building. Tessa speaking to someone on her phone, without her usual cheerful performance tone, a private voice sharp and unfiltered. I sat frozen as her words carried through the alley. She is just sitting on. Money, honestly, when she dies, we will finally get to live the way we deserve. And the blunt cruelty of it hit me with a pain so immediate and deep that it felt like someone had pressed a fist hard against my ribs. I stayed hidden in my car, not stepping forward or confronting her, because the woman she believed I was no longer existed, and instead of responding, I forced myself to absorb her words without letting them control me, making a quiet vow that Lily would never learn to measure love in dollars or inheritance the way her parents clearly did. When I finally drove home that afternoon, a faint dread tugged at my stomach, a sense that something heavier was waiting for me, and that feeling proved right when I opened my email and saw a message from Liberty Credit Union with the subject line loan status update, the kind of title that told me immediately nothing inside would be good news. The message explained that Brandon had missed another payment cycle, pushing his accounts into high-risk status and placing the business loan and building collateral under review for potential sale, a phrase that carried the cold precision of a trap, closing around someone who believed he was too clever to ever fall. At the bottom of the email, Carl had added a brief note asking if, given your legal position as co-owner and guarantor, you would like first refusal should the note go to auction. And reading those words felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing for the first time that the view below was not a fall, but a path, one that had always been there, waiting for me to acknowledge it. A path where I could step forward without fear, because the ground was legally and quietly mine. When I finished reading Carl's email, I sat at my kitchen table for a long moment, letting the words settle inside me, the way cold air settles across a quiet field, slow and steady and impossible to ignore. And when I finally picked up the phone to call Jenna, I felt as if I were stepping into a different version of my life, one where I no longer reacted, but decided one, where my choices shaped the ground beneath me, instead of letting Brandon's chaos dictate every tremor. Jenna answered quickly, and I explained everything I had received from the bank, the loan status, the approaching auction, the high-risk classification, and she listened with the same stillness she always carried before she delivered information that could change a person's direction. Then she spoke calmly and told me that if I used a portion of the money Mark left and combined it with the steady revenue from the storage units, I could purchase the entire note at a significant discount, perhaps 60 or 70% of its original value, because banks preferred fast, clean transfers over dragging out delinquency, especially with borrowers who showed escalating instability. Hearing those numbers spoken aloud made something click inside me, because they were familiar. They were the kind of calculations I handled every day at the hospital, except now the numbers were part of my story rather than someone else's payroll. And Jenna continued explaining that if I bought the note, I would become the primary creditor, the decision maker, the one with the power to enforce terms or restructure them entirely, essentially holding Brandon's financial heartbeat in my hand without him knowing it was me. She warned me that this step would take time, paperwork, and careful execution, but she also pointed out that from a legal standpoint, it was the most logical and least confrontational path, because instead of suing Brandon or dragging the family fracture into public view, I could simply step into the role the bank used to occupy, quiet and firm, and fully within the law. I agreed after a moment of steady breathing, and Jenna guided me through the process of forming a new limited liability company, one that carried no trace of my last name, a company that in the eyes of the world would be nothing more than an investment entity. And we settled on the name MC Reserve Holdings, a title that felt cool and distant, a financial mask that concealed every part of me, while also holding every inch of the ground Mark had built for us. We filed the paperwork that afternoon, and within 48 hours, the LLC was official, and Jenna forwarded the documents to Liberty Credit Union as part of the transfer request, explaining that MC Reserve Holdings wished to purchase the note outright. For the next few days, I lived in a strange limbo, going to work, processing payroll, answering emails, all while carrying a quiet knowledge that I was in the middle of a chess match. Brandon did not even realize had started. And the most surreal part was watching him continue his life online as if nothing were wrong. He posted photos from a weekend ski trip smiling next to Tessa, while she posed with perfect angles and scripted enthusiasm, the caption saying something about new beginnings and business wins, and I sat there staring at the screen thinking you remodeled your kitchen with your daughter's college fund, because I recognized the granite counters and cabinets behind them, the ones she had bragged about in her stories weeks earlier, the ones she claimed were financed through smart business moves, though I knew exactly where those missing $80,000 had gone. Their posts continued, Tessa showing off new shoes, new decor, new trips, and each image felt like a small blade twisting deeper. Not because of the money, but because of the pride and entitlement they carried while pretending everything was perfect. Meanwhile, I kept my silence, never commenting, never calling, simply observing their curated world as I moved quietly through the steps that would soon place Brandon's entire operation in my hands. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while I was reviewing timesheets at my desk, my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. But when I answered, I heard Carl's voice on the other end, steady but tinged with a subtle gravity as he said, "Miss Collins, I wanted to let you know the sale went through, and for a moment the room seemed to fall completely still as he continued speaking, explaining that as of today, MC Reserve Holdings is the sole holder of Brandon Collins' business loan and mortgage." I closed my eyes for a second, letting that truth sink into the deepest part of me, because this was not revenge by fury or impulse. This was revenge built from logic and patience, revenge that grew from the same stability I had carried all my life. And now that stability held my son's entire financial foundation. Carl added that official notices would be mailed to Brandon within 48 hours, informing him that the loan had been transferred to a new creditor. But of course, they would not reveal my involvement because the LLC made me invisible. And that invisibility felt like the first true advantage I had held in years. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair, my fingers resting against the wood of my desk, and for the first time since Christmas morning, I felt like I could breathe without pain curling in my chest. Brandon had no idea that the ground he stood on had shifted, no idea that the person he had dismissed as an old woman now held the financial pulse of his business, and in that quiet moment, I realized this was not about crushing him or humiliating him. It was about reclaiming the balance he had destroyed, about proving to myself that I had never been powerless, no matter how loudly he tried to paint me that way. The notice about the HOA meeting arrived the same week MC Reserve Holdings officially became the holder of Brandon's loan, and when I unfolded the letter at my kitchen counter, I felt an unexpected pull in my chest, a quiet instinct telling me that showing up in that room was not just possible now, but necessary because for years, Brandon had spoken loudly in spaces where I stayed invisible, and it was time the balance shifted, not through confrontation, but through presence, through allowing the truth to surface, without me forcing a single word. Liberty Lake held HOA meetings every quarter, usually in the small multi-purpose room near the community entrance. And although Brandon lived in one of the larger homes on the cul-de-sac, he never attended, always claiming he was too busy running a business while privately complaining about the association not clearing snow fast enough or sending him ridiculous warnings about improperly parked trucks. What he never mentioned was that he owed several quarters of unpaid fees he considered beneath him because he believed success excused responsibility. A few weeks earlier, I had quietly purchased a small 2-bedroom house on the opposite side of the neighborhood, not close enough to cross paths with Brandon daily, but close enough to be under the same HOA jurisdiction. And I used storage income to handle the down payment, thinking at the time it would simply give me a quiet place to retreat when Spokane winters felt too heavy. I never imagined that purchase would also become a stage where truth would finally reveal itself. When the evening of the meeting arrived, I wore a simple dark sweater and wool coat, nothing fancy, and walked into the community room carrying a folder more out of habit than need, and as I took a seat near the back, I saw Brandon striding in. Minutes later, his face already tight with annoyance, as if he were preparing for battle before the meeting even began. He did not see me at first, which allowed me a moment to breathe and observe him as he greeted no one, parking himself in a chair near the front, with the kind of confident entitlement that suggested he believed he was the most important person in any room he entered. The HOA president, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Ellen, called the meeting to order and began reading through the quarterly updates, snow removal schedules, and upcoming community events, and everything proceeded quietly until she reached the section addressing outstanding dues and recurring violations. Ellen cleared her throat with a hesitance that said she disliked confrontation, but she continued anyway, explaining that several residents were behind on fees, and she began listing names, her voice steady but firm, as she read the third name on the list: Brandon Collins delinquent for 3 quarters, multiple parking violations, and repeated complaints submitted against other residents without merit. A soft ripple moved through the room, a mix of recognition and discomfort. And for the first time, I saw Brandon's shoulders tense before he shot out of his chair and snapped that he paid more in taxes than half this block, and these meetings were a waste of his time because people should be grateful he even lived here. His voice carried an arrogance that made several heads turn, and one man in the second row stand with slow, controlled anger as he said loudly enough for the room to hear that Brandon did not even shovel his own sidewalk because he had watched me do it more than once. And the silence that followed cut sharply as Brandon's face shifted from rage to confusion and finally to dawning realization as murmurs spread and people began glancing around looking for me. I did not move or stand, but the simple fact that neighbors remembered me, that they had seen me on cold mornings clearing snow while Brandon slept in, or posted motivational videos, created a crack in the image he tried so hard to maintain. Then Ellen lifted her binder again and said, "Before we move on, I would also like to welcome a new homeowner to the community. Someone who recently purchased the small house on Ridgeview Lane, Ms. Maya Collins, and in that moment, Brandon's head snapped around so fast the chair beneath him squeaked across the floor. His eyes locked onto mine as if he were seeing me for the first time, truly seeing me, not as the old woman he dismissed, but as a presence inside his territory, a homeowner, a member, a person with equal standing, perhaps even more. The room shifted subtly, not in drama, but in awareness, the kind of awareness that changes how people perceive power. And though I did not say a word, the truth of my being there carried its own weight. Because for years, Brandon had built his image by pushing me out of sight, yet here I was seated in the same room with legal standing financial influence and the quiet authority of someone who did not need to announce anything. I nodded politely when Ellen welcomed me, offering a small smile that did not challenge, but did not retreat either. And when I saw Brandon's jaw tighten, I understood that he was recognizing something he could not name an imbalance, he could not immediately correct, And that recognition settled into my spine like a warm pulse, reminding me that the ground beneath us had shifted in a way he was not prepared for. 2 mornings after the HOA meeting, I woke before sunrise with an odd mix of steadiness and unease humming under my skin, a feeling that told me the next step in this long, silent war had arrived. And as I sat at my kitchen table sipping weak coffee, I reviewed the notice of default Jenna had prepared under the name of MC Reserve Holdings, reading each line carefully until I felt its weight settle with finality. Then I signed it and placed it in the envelope addressed to Brandon's business office. Sending that notice was less a strike and more the natural consequence of a pattern he had set into motion with every late payment and every careless decision. And even though my hands trembled slightly as I sealed the envelope, I knew it was not from fear, but from the strange gravity of stepping into power I had long forgotten belonged to me. When the notice arrived at his HVAC office later that week, I was not there, but I imagined the moment vividly, the receptionist handing him the thick envelope, his confident grin fading as he tore it open and saw the formal language informing him that he was officially in default, that he had 30 days to bring his account current, or he would face foreclosure, asset seizure, and legal escalation, all written in the unemotional tone of financial authority. The kind of tone he had always assumed belonged only to people wealthier or more connected than himself. I did not expect a calm response, and I was proven right when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Carl later that afternoon, not from him, but from Brandon, screaming in the background as Carl tried to explain that the credit union no longer handled the loan because it had been sold, and in the recorded chaos, I could hear Brandon shouting that this was ridiculous and that he refused to be threatened by some faceless vulture fund, his voice cracking with the disbelief of a man who had never imagined accountability could come for him wrapped in legal language he did not understand. Carl's voice, calm and tired, came through clearly near the end of the message as he said, "Brandon, you need to deal with MC Reserve Holdings. Now we are no longer involved." Then the call ended abruptly, leaving me with a quiet, grim ache in my chest, not out of pity, but out of recognition that this was the first time he had been forced to face the consequences of treating life like a game he could cheat his way through. Later that evening, I opened my laptop and saw that Brandon had posted a new photo on social media, showing him standing beside a freshly renovated kitchen, boasting about hard-earned upgrades and a strong quarter for the business. And when I stared at the glossy white cabinets and gleaming countertops, I felt a cold clarity settle inside me as I whispered aloud, "You remodeled your kitchen with your daughter's college fund because the truth sat so starkly beneath every detail that I almost tasted the bitterness of it." The next day, according to Jenna's prediction, Brandon spiraled storming into the credit union, demanding answers. And when he learned that the loan had indeed been transferred, he returned home in a fury, complaining loudly to Tessa that greedy financial firms were trying to bully him. And this was when the ugliest part of their thinking emerged, the part I had always feared, but never heard plainly until now. Tessa suggested softly but with a sharp practical edge that he could just move some more money from Lily's account again, just until the business recovers. No one will know. And the fact that she spoke those words so easily without even a tremor of hesitation made my stomach twist, because it showed not desperation but entitlement, as if the future of their daughter existed only as a safety net for their lifestyle. Brandon, rattled and angry, actually opened his laptop and began typing into the online banking portal, and for a moment, I imagined his finger hovering over the transfer button, ready to drain whatever remained from Lily's fund so they could keep up appearances on social media and avoid tightening their budget for even a month. But before he could complete the attempt, the system threw an error message, one telling him that the account had been frozen by another authorized owner. And when he stormed into the bank, demanding clarification, the teller informed him with polite firmness that a legal hold had been placed and that he no longer had withdrawal access. I was not there to witness his face when he heard the words, "There's a legal hold placed by another owner. You can't touch these funds anymore. But I could imagine the shock spiraling into confusion, the confusion hardening into fear, and the fear collapsing into the first real awareness that something far bigger than a loan notice was closing in around him. For the first time in years, Brandon was not in control, and the realization did not come from a confrontation or a shouted argument, but from the quiet machinery of legal authority working against him in ways he had never anticipated, ways he had once mocked me for understanding. And as I sat in my small living room that night listening to the soft hum of the heater, I felt the slightest flicker of sadness for the boy he had once been, quickly followed by a rising certainty that the man he had become could no longer be allowed to harm anyone else, especially the granddaughter who deserved so much better than being used as a financial fallback. Brandon showed up 3 days after the bank froze the accounts, pounding on my front door with the kind of rage that makes the wood vibrate, shouting my name as if the walls themselves owed him an answer. And when I finally approached the entryway, I could see his shadow thrashing across the frosted glass like a storm trapped in a small space. His voice raw as he yelled, "Are you behind this? The loan, the accounts, the HOA. What are you doing, old woman?" Each word thrown like a stone meant to break something inside me, something he assumed was still fragile. I opened the door without flinching and stepped aside so he could enter. Not because I feared he would cause a scene in front of the neighbors, but because for the first time in our lives, I wanted him to see what it looked like when I stood still and unshaken, while he unraveled, and as he stormed into my living room, his boots scattering melted snow across the floor. I simply closed the door behind us with a quiet click that felt louder than all his shouting. He turned quickly and jabbed a finger toward me, accusing me of sabotaging his life and his family, as if I were some lurking enemy waiting for the moment to strike. Telling me I was ruining everything he had built, twisting the entire disaster into a narrative where he was the victim and I was the one swinging the hammer. His words came fast and messy. "You are tearing us apart. You are sabotaging my business. You are trying to make us look like monsters." And when he said us, he meant himself and Tessa, because in his mind their partnership was a fortress built on curated perfection, not on the fraud and shortcuts hiding beneath the surface. For a long moment I let him rage, let him spill every angry accusation as he paced around my small living room, and when he finally stopped to catch his breath, I walked slowly to the coffee table and placed down the documents I had arranged the night before, because something in me knew this confrontation was coming. Something in me wanted to prepare for the moment he would realize that the truth was heavier than the lies he built his pride on. I laid out the printed transactions from Lily's 529 account, showing every unauthorized withdrawal, every forged signature shaped into a sloppy imitation of my handwriting. Then the notice of default he had received from MC Reserve Holdings, and finally, the scanned copy of the original loan contract Mark had emailed years ago, the one outlining the rights of the co-owner he had pretended did not exist. When he stared at the papers, his face shifted from anger to confusion, to something darker, something close to panic, and I finally spoke softly but firmly, telling him, "You forged my name. You stole from your daughter. You threw me out on Christmas morning. This is not me ruining your life. This is your life knocking back." The words hung in the air, steady and unavoidable, and I could see the moment they landed because his shoulders slumped an inch, as if the weight of what he had done was finally pressing into his skin, instead of sliding off like every other consequence he had dodged. He started to speak again, but this time the rage sounded forced, as though he was trying to summon a version of himself that no longer fit the moment, insisting that I had no right to interfere, and that everything he did was to protect his family. But I cut him off gently by saying, "Brandon, sit down," and to my quiet astonishment he did, sinking into the edge of the sofa like a man who had run out of angles to argue from. I sat across from him, not beside him, and revealed only what he needed to know, telling him that I was co-owner of the building he used for his business, that I held the loan. now that the accounts he had planned to drain again were legally protected, not by the bank, but by the trust created for Lily, a trust he could not access, even if he tried. His eyes widened, not in anger this time, but in a mixture of disbelief and the first flicker of fear, the kind that comes when a person realizes the ground beneath them is not stable, and that the person they underestimated has been standing on bedrock while they danced on ice. Then I delivered the final truth, the one that shifted the air in the room, as I said, "You have 30 days not to pay me, but to prove you are not the man you have been acting like." And I watched his expression crumble, because he expected a demand for money, a threat, an ultimatum he could fight against or negotiate. But instead, I gave him something harder, something that required character rather than cash. I told him plainly that if he continued the pattern of lies and financial abuse, I would file the complaint Jenna had already drafted, the one that documented every fraudulent withdrawal, every forged signature, every act that fit the definition of elder financial exploitation, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything that had filled my house in years. He opened his mouth once as if to protest, but nothing came out because there was no excuse suitable for the man he had turned himself into. And after a long moment, he stood slowly, his anger drained into a hollow tremor of uncertainty, and he walked toward the door without slamming it, without shouting, without a final cutting remark. As he stepped outside into the cold air, he looked back at me, not with hatred, but with the wary bewilderment of someone facing a version of the world he had never imagined, a world where I was no longer the woman he could dismiss, or guilt, or bend to his will. And when the door closed between us, I felt something inside me tighten and release. At the same time, a surge of grief and strength mingled together, reminding me that revenge was not the point accountability was. And for the first time, Brandon had been given both. The weeks that followed our confrontation unfolded the way slow structural failure does in an old house, not with one thunderous collapse, but with a series of quiet cracks spreading beneath the surface. And even from a distance, I could sense the way Brandon's business was beginning to strain under the weight of unpaid invoices and vanishing clients. Because every few days I heard murmurs in town about HVAC jobs, delayed service calls, unanswered, and contracts falling through after customers posted scathing reviews online describing missed appointments and unprofessional behavior. I did not gloat or revel in it the way some people might have, because watching your child's world crumble is never satisfying in the simple way outsiders assume it is a complicated ache that mixes sorrow with justice until the emotions are indistinguishable. And still I knew this spiral was not caused by my actions, but by choices he had made long before I ever stepped in. 3 weeks after our private showdown, he finally returned to my doorstep. But instead of pounding on the door with fury, he knocked softly, a hesitant rap that almost made me think a stranger was standing outside. And when I opened the door, he stood there, with his shoulders angled inward, his voice low and uncharacteristically calm, as he said, "Mom, can we talk?" And for a moment I studied his face, searching for sincerity, something real, something resembling the boy I once raised. I stepped aside and let him in again, and he walked slowly into the living room where the documents from our last confrontation still sat neatly in a closed folder on the shelf, a silent reminder of every truth he had tried to outrun. He sat on the edge of the couch like a man afraid the cushions might swallow him, and began speaking softly, words carefully chosen to sound humble, as he said, "Mom, we are family, and families are supposed to help each other." And I listened quietly, even as my chest tightened, because his tone was gentle, but the entitlement beneath it pulsed like a second heartbeat. He asked me to sign the house over to him or to wipe the loan entirely, insisting I did not need all this and that I was alone anyway. And his voice carried a subtle pressure, dressed as concern, as he added that they were my only real family, and that Lily would be the one to suffer. if I did not cooperate using her name again as a bargaining chip, the way he always did when his back pressed against a wall. What struck me most was not the audacity of the request, but the absence of anything resembling an apology. Not even a passing acknowledgement of Christmas morning, or the fraud, or the insults, or the cruelty. Only a desperate attempt to regain the comfort he had lost, and I realized in that moment that he did not want reconciliation. He wanted restoration of the power he once had over me. I told him calmly that I would not sign over my property, that I would not erase the loan, that I would not be the emergency fund he turned to whenever he refused to face reality. And at first he nodded as if he understood. But when I suggested he could begin repaying his debts by selling the second truck he barely used or the cabin Tessa flaunted online as their relaxation retreat, his expression snapped from false humility to stunned outrage, the kind that came not from hardship, but from having his lifestyle threatened. He sputtered that those things were not on the table, that they were part of his family's quality of life, that I was being unreasonable for even suggesting it. And in that moment, the thin mask of remorse dissolved completely, revealing the same entitlement that had fueled every bad decision he had made this past year. He rose from the couch, sharply pacing as he muttered about loyalty and sacrifice, accusing me of turning against him, and I let him talk without interruption, because sometimes letting a person hear their own excuses aloud is the sharpest form of clarity. When he finally stopped and looked at me, waiting for me to bend the way I always had in the past, I simply shook my head and told him quietly, "Brandon, this is the path you chose and only you can repair it." And the silence that followed landed between us like a stone, dropping into deep water. A few days later, after Jenna reviewed the latest loan figures and confirmed that Brandon had made no effort to restructure or pay even a portion of what he owed, I sat at my desk and drafted a registered letter on behalf of MC Reserve Holdings, informing him formally that failure to restructure according to the proposal would result in foreclosure proceedings on the office building, a notice written in clear legal language that carried the weight of consequence without a single emotional flourish. Before sealing the envelope, I copied the letter to Jenna for legal record-keeping, to Carl for account acknowledgement, and to the HOA president as part of the required community disclosure for commercial properties in delinquency, a small detail that ensured this step would not remain entirely private, but also not scandalous, just transparent enough for accountability to take root in the places where Brandon had long relied on image to sweep his negligence out of view. When I carried the letter to the post office and watched it slide into the outgoing bin, a strange stillness washed over me. Not triumph or vindication, but a calm recognition that I had taken the most measured step available, that I had drawn a boundary without cruelty, that I had offered a path forward he simply refused to walk. The foreclosure hearing was scheduled for a cold, gray Monday morning, the kind of morning where the clouds hang low as if waiting for something to break. And when I drove to the small county building on the east side of Spokane, I felt a quiet heaviness settle inside me. Not fear and not regret, but a sharp awareness that this was the moment where private truth would finally become public, where the story Brandon had crafted for years would collide with the reality he had spent so long refusing to face. The meeting room was modest, with pale walls and rows of metal chairs, and when I entered unnoticed through the back door, I chose a seat in the second row content to let the anonymity of the crowd settle over me as the credit union officers shuffled papers at the front table. Minutes later, Brandon burst through the main door wearing a suit that looked slightly wrinkled, his posture stiff with agitation as he scanned the room in search of the faceless vulture fund rep he had complained about endlessly over the last month, telling anyone who would listen that some predatory financial group was trying to destroy his business out of greed. He did not see me at first, which allowed me a moment to observe him as he dropped heavily into a chair near the front, his leg bouncing with nervous energy, his jaw set in the same stubborn line he carried when he was a teenager, caught in a lie. When the door opened again and Jenna walked in, holding a slim leather portfolio, every officer at the table nodded to her with quiet respect, and I saw Brandon jerk upright at the sight of her, his confusion cutting through his anger as he whispered to someone nearby that she must be the attorney representing the fund. He had no idea she was mine, no idea the ground under him was about to split open. The proceeding began with the formalities of delinquency acknowledgement and collateral review, all spoken in the emotionless cadence of financial procedure, and Brandon sat rigidly waiting for his opportunity to interrupt. It came sooner than expected when one of the officers stated that the note now belonged to MC Reserve Holdings, and Brandon leapt to his feet, demanding to know who owned the company, who was pulling the strings, who was hiding behind this firm that had pushed him into a corner. His voice echoed too loudly in the small room, and Jenna, who remained composed as ever, looked at him with a steady expression before she said the words that felt like a stone dropped into still water. MC Reserve Holdings is managed by one member. Her name is Maya Collins. The silence that followed was abrupt and complete, a thick, stunned pause that wrapped around the room like heavy fabric, and I watched Brandon turn slowly as if his body were moving through syrup, his eyes landing on me in the second row with a shock so raw it stripped every layer of arrogance from his face. The look that passed between us in that moment was not rage or betrayal, but a dawning comprehension that everything he believed about control and power had been wrong, that the person he had dismissed and belittled was the same person quietly holding the legal fate of his business in her hands. The officers continued speaking, reviewing payment history and necessary restructuring terms, but Brandon's attention was fixed on me, disbelief shaking through him, like someone waking from a nightmare into a worse reality. When the agreement was finally placed before him, he stared at the papers with a tight jaw, the pages outlining that he would lose partial ownership of the building and surrounding lot, transferring majority control to MC Reserve Holdings. He would retain only the right to lease a portion of the space to continue operating his HVAC business, and only if he met monthly payment terms without fail, otherwise the eviction clause would activate and he would be forced to vacate. The officers explained the terms slowly, as if speaking to someone fragile, but Brandon understood completely, the truth settling into his bones with a visible weight as he realized this was not a negotiation, this was consequence. After a long moment, he signed the pen, trembling slightly in his hand, and the sound of it scraping the paper felt like the release of years of denial, stubbornness, and reckless entitlement. When the hearing ended, the room emptied slowly, people shuffling quietly, as if unsure whether they had witnessed justice or tragedy, and I remained seated for a moment, allowing the emotions to settle before standing. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard fast footsteps behind me, followed by Tessa's shrill voice cutting through the space like a blade. "You destroyed your own son." Her face twisted with accusation, her voice carrying the dramatic tremble of someone who believes outrage is a shield. But before the hallway could fill with her performance, I answered with the calm I had earned through every painful step of this journey. "No." I stopped him from destroying his daughter. The hallway fell silent as the words settled and Tessa's expression cracked. For the first time, her anger flickering into something closer to fear or recognition, because deep down, she knew the truth of it. I did not stay to watch the rest. I simply walked out into the cold air, feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes not from revenge, but from alignment, from the understanding that justice had found its place at last. 6 months passed in a rhythm so different from the storm that came before that sometimes I found myself pausing in the middle of small, quiet moments just to acknowledge the stillness, the way peace settles, not all at once, but in layers, like soft snow covering a field that was once trampled by footsteps. After the foreclosure hearing and everything that unraveled around it, I made a decision that surprised even me. a decision to leave my stressful full-time job at the hospital, where I had processed payroll for years, and instead move into a part-time position at the community library, a space filled with the sound of turning pages and whispered conversations, instead of ringing phones and urgent deadlines. The first morning I shelved books under warm yellow lights, I felt something unclench in my chest that I had not realized was wound so tightly, and I understood then that healing does not always mean undoing the past. Sometimes it simply means releasing the grip it had on you. With my new schedule, I finally had time to focus on the storage facility Mark had left behind, a place that had once been nothing more than a quiet stream of income, but now felt like an anchor, a reminder of the steady, thoughtful choices we made together. I upgraded the entire property, installing new cameras, improving lighting, and adding an automatic gate that made the tenants feel safer. And with those changes, the revenue stabilized in a way that allowed me to breathe, knowing I had built something reliable from the pieces life had handed me. The building Brandon once believed belonged only to him began to blossom too. Not through sudden miracles, but through intentional steps, a fresh coat of paint that brightened the exterior, updated signage, and eventually 2 new offices leased out to small local businesses, a therapist who worked with veterans, and a woman who ran a bookkeeping service, both grateful for the affordable rent and consistent management. Creating those additional sources of income was not an act of revenge, but one of reclamation, a way of shaping the place into something useful and honest, something that reflected the life I wanted moving forward. Brandon did not disappear from my world entirely, though he remained at a distance that felt healthier for both of us. His business, now trimmed down without the inflated lifestyle he once tried to maintain, forced him back into the field as a technician rather than a self-proclaimed boss, and although he no longer drove the expensive truck or flaunted his success online, he seemed steadier in a strange way, like a man finally feeling the ground under his feet instead of pretending to float above it. He rarely contacted me, but when he did, his words were measured, respectful, even not warm, yet no longer laced with the sharp disrespect he once wielded so freely, and I knew that change did not come from humiliation, but from consequence, from finally having to live within the boundaries he had spent years ignoring. Tessa kept her distance too, her online presence noticeably toned down, fewer videos about perfect family moments and more posts about simple routines, and while I did not follow her life closely, I sensed that the performance she once clung to had lost some of its shine after being confronted with reality she could not edit away. What mattered most to me, though, was Lily. One cool spring afternoon, I opened my email and saw a message from the trustee managing her education fund, a brief update confirming that the account was secure, growing steadily untouched and protected until she was ready to use it. Right beneath that email sat another one this time from Lily herself, a simple note that read, "Grandma, thank you for not letting them touch my future." And the moment I read those words, my eyes stung with a kind of gratitude that reached deeper than any victory ever could. It reminded me that every painful step, every boundary drawn, every quiet choice to stay firm had been worth it, not for revenge, but for legacy, for the chance to give the next generation something better than what they had been handed. As summer approached, I spent more time on the small porch of the duplex I had purchased months earlier, a cozy place with a wooden chair that creaked softly when I leaned back, the kind of home that felt earned rather than inherited. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long orange shadows across the yard, I brought out the old folder that held the drafted elder abuse complaint, the document Jenna and I had prepared during the darkest days, and I sat with it in my lap for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Then, with steady hands, I tore the pages into thin strips and fed them gently into the small fire pit beside the porch, watching the flames curl around the paper until the words that once defined my pain turned into ash and floated upward into the cooling air. It was not forgiveness in the way people romanticize it, but it was a release, a quiet acceptance that I no longer needed to hold that blade to protect myself, because I had already built the life that made me safe. As the last scrap burned away, I whispered to the empty yard, I am not just an old woman, I am the woman who learned she was never helpless. And the truth of that line settled through me with a warmth deeper than the fire. So if you have ever been called old or useless, or treated like your money mattered more than your heart, you are not alone. Tell me where you are listening from. I read every story, especially from women who believe they were powerless. You are not.